Ideas That Shaped Egyptian Life by Rena Korb. The World of Ancient Egypt. Thousands of years ago, a civilization rose up along the banks of the Nile River. The ancient Egyptians developed a rich culture with a royal ruler, a form of writing, and religious beliefs. The Egyptians worshipped many gods and goddesses. They believed that these gods and goddesses controlled the natural forces of the world, such as the flooding of the Nile or the rising and setting of the sun. Gods and goddesses. Religious beliefs guided the people for thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians worshipped at least 700 gods and goddesses. The gods and goddesses all had one or more special roles. Most Egyptian gods and goddesses were linked to different animals. Artwork often showed a god or goddess with the body of a human and the head of an animal. Sometimes the animals were linked to the god's special powers. For example, Anubis, the god of the dead, may have been linked to jackals because these animals often were seen around graveyards. The Egyptian gods were neither all good or all bad, nor were they all-powerful or all-knowing. They did have special powers, such as living almost forever, but they often acted like humans. Pharaohs sometimes wore a falcon headdress to show their close ties to Horus. Horus was represented by a falcon. While Egyptians believed in many gods, some were more important than others. In the 1900s BC, two gods, Amun and Ra, became one god known as Amun-Ra, or simply Ra. Ra was the sun god and the king of the gods. Osiris was the god of the underworld, a place where people went after they died. From his home in the underworld, Osiris also ruled as a god of agriculture and used his power to make crops grow. Horus was the son of Osiris, and Egyptians believed he ruled Egypt as its first king. The pharaoh was closely tied to these gods. Egyptians even believed that all pharaohs were sons of Ra. While the pharaoh was alive, however, Egyptians looked upon him as the god Horus. The pharaoh also served as the chief priest, and one of his important jobs was keeping the gods happy. Why did the ancient Egyptians have so many gods? Ancient Egyptians did not understand the forces of nature. These forces seemed both good and bad. For example, the Egyptians depended on the Nile River. The flooding of the Nile made the soil fertile for farming. If the floods came early or late, there would be no crops. High floods wiped out villages. The Egyptians hoped that keeping these gods happy would make them more reliable. The temples. Gods had their own temples, and major gods had more than one. Unlike temples today, people did not worship there. Instead, temples were considered the homes of the gods. At each temple there was a statue of the god or goddess, often made of gold. Every morning, as the sun rose, the priests entered. "Awake in peace, great God," they chanted while the head priest opened the doors of the sacred shrine, or holy place. The priest bathed the statue, dressed it in clothes and jewels, and offered it fine food and drink. Throughout the day, the priests performed ceremonies, singing to the statue in praise and to entertain it. They also presented the statue to royal visitors. While common people could not enter the temples, they could bring gifts to the god in times of trouble. At sundown, the priest put the statue to bed by closing the doors of the shrine and leaving the temple. Egyptians could visit outside the temple when they needed help. One memorial stone was found inscribed with the prayer of an artist named Nebra, who asked Ra to help his dying son. Temples also celebrated many festivals. On these occasions, royalty and common people came together to honor the gods and act out stories about them. Each god also had a feast day. The Feast of Amun, which lasted for 24 days, began at his temple in Karnak. The pharaoh marched at the head of a group of priests who carried Amun's statue from the temple to a boat covered with gold. The priest then brought Amun's statue to his other temple at Luxor. Along the banks of the Nile, crowds gathered to watch and celebrate. Myths and legends. Egyptians told myths or stories about their gods and goddesses and about the world. Depending on where they lived, the ancient Egyptians told several different stories to explain the beginning of the world. One popular version of this myth said that Ra rose from a swirling ocean and made 8 other gods. For a while, Ra lived on earth. As he grew older, Ra became tired of the disorder in the world. Though Ra went back to the heavens, he carried the sun across the sky in his special boat every day. At night, Ra traveled below the surface of earth to the east. The next morning, he made his journey again. Isis was one of the most important goddesses of ancient Egypt. She was the wife of Osiris and the mother of Horus. She was believed to have great healing powers. There is one myth where she brings her husband Osiris back to life after he was killed by her brother Seth. Because of this, people called on her when they were sick. Because she feared that Seth might harm Horus, she sheltered him while he was still young. Therefore, she was also seen as a goddess of protection. In another myth, Horus grew up and finally defeated Seth in battle. The afterlife. Egyptians believed that death was not the end of life. Instead, death was the start of the next life, or the afterlife. Egyptians believed that after death, a person's soul rose from the body and went on to a journey to the underworld. The person faced many challenges along the way. He or she needed to pass through guarded doors and stay away from monsters and fierce animals. For help on this journey, the person often sang praises and hymns to the gods. The end of the journey was not the beginning of the afterlife. First, the person faced judgment. Anyone who had done evil in life could not enter the underworld. Instead, a monster with the head of a crocodile would devour the person, so the person could never live in the afterlife. However, if the person had not done evil, he or she would be taken to Osiris and entered the next world. The next world was like Egypt, only better, where family and friends were gathered together. Why make mummies? Egyptians' beliefs about the soul led them to preserve dead bodies as mummies. Egyptians believed that the soul was made up of the Akh, the Ba, and the Ka. The Akh left the body and went to live forever in the next world. However, the Ba and the Ka stayed behind in the tomb, where the body lay at rest. Without the physical body, the soul could not exist. Priests made Egyptian people from the poorest laborers all the way up to the pharaoh into mummies. Tombs and pyramids. Egyptians believed that people needed certain items to help them make their journey to the afterlife. Egyptians were buried with food and drink, clothing, tools, mummies of pets, whatever a person might need. For example, children were buried with toys, while soldiers were buried with weapons. Because most people were expected to toil in the fields in the afterlife, wealthy people and royalty often had small figures made of stone or wood buried with them. In the afterlife, these figures could do any required work. Egyptian tombs also included the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead was a collection of spells, prayers, hymns, and myths told through words and pictures. Egyptians believed it helped the dead make the journey to the next world. Religious beliefs led to one of the most amazing structures in the world, the Egyptian pyramids. To make sure that a king's body was safe, Egyptians built enormous stone pyramids. These triangular-sided buildings rose high above the sands on the western side of the Nile River. Cemeteries were usually located in the west in Egypt because the west was where the sun set or died each night. The pyramids were built to last for centuries. They were made of large stone blocks. The pharaoh's mummy lay in the burial chamber deep inside the pyramid. The only way to reach the special chamber was through a narrow, hidden tunnel. Religion and everyday life. Egyptians also worshipped the gods in their own homes. Wealthy people built shrines in their gardens. Even the poorest households set up a small shrine in a corner of a room. At these shrines, people made offerings and said prayers to the gods. People also painted images of their gods on the walls and wore their symbols or images as good luck charms. Egyptians often built shrines for the gods that had special meaning to them. A craftsperson might have a shrine for Ptah, the god of craftsmanship, while a scribe might worship Thoth, the god of learning. The end of the Egyptian religion. For thousands of years, religion was a major part of the Egyptian way of life. Beginning in 332 BC, the Egyptian culture began to change. That year, the Greeks, under Alexander the Great, took over Egypt. Alexander declared himself a son of Amun-Ra and became the pharaoh. About 300 years later, the Romans conquered Egypt. Christianity followed soon afterward. By AD 200, several Christian communities had developed in Egypt. Some used the temples as churches. In the 600s, Muslims invaded and controlled Egypt. Soon, most Egyptians practiced the new religion of Islam. Today, most Egyptians still practice Islam. However, some Egyptians keep the ancient Egyptian myths alive by retelling stories and remembering the gods.